This is going to be 10 stories of history related to Anderson's West 8th Street. We'll do 10 today, and then when we come back here in May, I'll do 10 more. This was all inspired by the very first story I'm going to share with you. After doing the research for this first story, I thought, gee whiz, so much has happened along 8th Street over the years, it deserves telling. I can't think of another thoroughfare in Madison County that it has as much history tied to it as Anderson's West 8th Street. My first story, a cache of neatly stacked stones was recently found buried in an area that overlooks 8th Street Road near the White River. An examination of the stones suggests they were hand-fashioned centuries ago. I'm thinking around 1500 BCE, which would make them today 3,900 years old, by a prehistoric Native American. The stones were used in an ancient slingshot to bring down animals that ventured along the old trace seeking water from the river. That old trace was the forerunner of today's 8th Street. I got a phone call from a lady whose name she asked me not to reveal, saying that this was in the fall a couple years ago. She said, I was out working in my garden. And she said, I was down on my knees, had my right hand resting on the ground. My left hand was over here resting on the ground, and I started to dig, and all of a sudden my left hand broke through the ground. And she said it revealed a cavity in my garden that was perfectly round and about a foot deep and stacked in the shape of a pyramid were stones inside of this cavity. And she said, what are they? And she said, if I showed them to you, do you think you could identify them or tell me the story behind it? So she sent me a picture. I looked at them, and I had an idea as to what they were. I ended up going over to her house, where she showed me where all of this happened. And what she had found were stones like you see here that I believe were put there by a prehistoric Native American around 1500 BCE as a place where he stored them so that when he went to hunt animals which came to the White River to drink, he was positioned in order to be able to kill with a slingshot. I bring you the story, or remind you the story of David and Goliath, because it was critical for him to be able to bring down an animal, because that's what he fed himself and his family with. So he had to be proficient at the use of it. Those stones were all hand-fashioned, you could tell. There they are on the left. You can see the marks around them. They're all hand-fashioned. There's about 20 of them. There's 3 different sizes. This is the area where they were found, and this is the general area along 8th Street, which the river is right here, where they were found. I'm convinced that in the round hole, perfectly round hole, was probably at one time a woven basket that contained the stones, and over the centuries, the basket deteriorated but left the outline of the hole, and there was all that was left of the stones. 3,900 years ago. We know that West 8th Street was originally a buffalo trace, although buffalo is the wrong usage. They are bison. We didn't have buffalo in North America. We have bison. but it was a bison trace, wild animal trace, and they would come to the river to drink. So it would make sense for a hunter to wait in seclusion until they came and then use his slingshot to bring them down. Story number 2 today is the Connor Trail, about 1800. The Connor Trail began at John Connor's trading post, southeast of Brookville. It ran north through Connorsville and followed a northerly direction passing Newcastle to the east, where it split into 2 forks. The West Fork turned slightly northwest until it reached Andersonstown. Here it joined what was called the Indian Road, or what I term the East Fork of the Connor Trail. The Connor Trail entered Andersonstown on the southeast side. The trail exited the village by today's 8th Street and continued west to Strawtown, where it turned south following White River to William Connor's trading post, Connor Prairie. John Connor, William Connor's brother, had a trading post south of Brookville here, and the Indian Trail, or the Connor Trail, then made its way north through Connorsville, past Newcastle, where it forked. The East Fork took it to the Delaware Indian village of Becongahelis town here, and then it made its way across the river and back to eventually Anderson. The West Fork went directly into Anderson. The two then joined in downtown Anderson and continued west along the river, ending at William Connor's trading post. So this was, for its day, Interstate 69. It was the main trading trail, the main path of commerce between those 2 sites. Number 3 today is Chief Anderson's Lodge. His home was located on what is today the southeast corner of 8th Street and Central Avenue, immediately south of where the Madison County Jail now stands. One account says his residence was a 2-story double cabin, one side of which was occupied by him and his family, and the other by his son. The son that would have been there would have been Sarcoxy. We have a picture of the number 1 fire station at 8th and Central Avenue. Probably a lot of you in this room remember that. It's now no longer there. But let your eyes drift over here. You see that little house? That's Chief Anderson's house. It's clapboard now, but it was a log cabin. And we know that because the Berry family, John and Sally Berry, moved to Anderson to become Indian agents for this area to facilitate the leaving of the Delaware in 1821. They had a son, Nineveh. They occupied Chief Anderson's house. Nineveh was raised there, continued to live here until he passed away in his later years, and he would tell people over and over again, I was raised in Chief Anderson's house. That's how we know that. Unfortunately, there wasn't anybody around in 1969 like me, and when they decided to put the Eisenhower Bridge in, they tore it down. So we don't have it. Delaware Indian departure, 1798 to 1821 is our next story today. Chief Anderson and the Delaware did not leave until September the 20th, 1821, using almost all of the 3 years that had been granted to them through the Treaty of St. Mary's in 1818. In late August and early September, the Delaware Indians began collecting preparatory for their departure to their new home in Missouri. The scene at Andersontown has been described by a few who witnessed it. We have accounts of it in our history. They said that 50 canoes floated on the river while a herd of ponies and pack horses bearing the camp equipage of the tribe stood ready for the journey. You see, the United States government, when the treaty was concluded, they were actually asking all of the Native Americans in what then was Indiana, because Indiana had become a state 2 years earlier in 1816, and it was a desire of the federal government to move the Native Americans out so that settlement could take place. Knowing that they were going to go west of the Mississippi River, but not knowing exactly where they were going to go, they knew they would need horses, ponies. When they first brought that herd of ponies into the Delaware, 1,396 ponies. 1,396 ponies. It's recorded. The Delaware said, what are we going to do with that? See, this had been a wooded area. A horse is no good in the woods. But little did they know they were going to the prairies and they would need them. And soon it became a very valuable staple to them. The young braves and women were to go overland while the aged members of the tribe were to travel by water. That was the arrangement. Those who were traveling by land would have followed the old Indian road leading from Andersontown. Today, West 8th Street Road roughly follows that same route. This picture I took from the John F. Kennedy Bridge of Character, the Blue Bridge, that crosses the river downtown as a footbridge taking people across to Park Place, to Edgewater Park. It would be in this area right here, because the village was located here, it would be in this area right here where those 50 canoes were assembled. And then they began to make their journey, and we have accounts in our early histories that tell how the settlers who had arrived, the pioneers, they lined the banks of the White River to wave goodbye. There was a strong relationship between the Delaware and the settlers here, a very friendly, positive relationship, and they gathered to bid them goodbye. The last they were seen was out at West 8th Street. This would have been the last before they left the county. Those traveling by land would have used this route, the old Connor Trail. Little did they know that what lay ahead of them was heartbreak, terrible heartbreak, and that's a whole nother story for another session. Number 5, keeping with Chief Anderson, is a legend that evolved on September the 20th, 1891. There's also a legend that says 20 years after his departure, he returned to visit his daughter, was stricken with fever, and died on the 3rd day after he arrived in the town of Anderson. That same story states that 50 years later, when excavating for the Hotel Anderson on North Meridian Street, the bones of the old chief were unearthed, but reburied under the foundation of the building. Miss Nellie Lovett, who lived at 431 West 8th Street and was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Lovett, wrote a beautiful story or legend of Chief Anderson, telling of the finding of his skeleton under the Hotel Anderson. That is the Lovett home at 431 West 8th Street, where what I'm going to read to you now was written. The legend closes with the following, and this is a quote. It is said that on the night of the 20th day of September 1891, the 70th anniversary of the exodus of the Delaware, just as the clock in the tower of the courthouse struck the hour of midnight, a ghostly form of an Indian, clad in full habiliments of a Delaware chieftain, might have been seen standing erect on the highest crest of the unfinished building, we're talking about the Hotel Anderson, with folded arms looking toward the east, just as the chieftain had stood on the morning of his departure 70 years before. It remained thus for a moment and faded out in a cloud of mist. This was Nellie Lovett's description, and it became gospel for years in this area until I proved that Chief Anderson's actually buried in Wyandotte County, Kansas. Sorry about that. That's the Hotel Anderson. I can vaguely remember it. It's now the parking lot for Star Financial Bank on Meridian Street between 7th, at the corner of southwest corner of 7th Street. And supposedly, according to her poem, why somewhere on this unfinished building, was her description of Chief Anderson. Outside of the entrance to Anderson Country Club is this relief of Chief Anderson. At the entrance, there was a second relief produced. It was over the bar in the Hotel Anderson. When they tore the hotel down, one of our members went down there and grabbed it, and we now have it in our possession in the basement at our museum. Story number 6, Milton White, November 1, 1867. A crowd of 10,000 excited people converged on Anderson on a fall day in 1867 to witness a public execution. Milton White was hung for the murder of his neighbor, Daniel Hoppus. The story begins on April 8th of that year when Hoppus found that some meat he had been stolen from him. Tracks leading from his smokehouse led to the house of his neighbor, Milton White. Upon this discovery, Hoppus, who lived north of what is today 38th Street and a short distance east of Scatterfield Road, and a neighbor started for Anderson to have a search warrant issued. Near what was known as the Junction, the area immediately north of the former Philadelphia Quartz site today, the two encountered White, who agreed to go with Hoppus to White's home so that Hoppus could search for the missing meat. Hoppus and White followed the Chicago and Cincinnati Railroad, the former Pennsylvania Railroad tracks, east to the East Anderson and New Columbus Pike, we know it as Scatterfield Road, where they turned south and proceeded to near 38th Street, where they turned east following a path to a pasture in the woods. Several persons later testified seeing the two men walking together that day. The last witness to see them stated that the two were headed for a pasture not far from the path leading in the direction of their homes, and that is where the body of Hoppus was found the following day. Severe blows had crushed his head and face. The weapon, a 4-foot sassafras club, was found a short distance away, covered with blood and hair. When Hoppus did not return home, his wife became alarmed and informed the neighbors. The neighbors knew about the stolen meat and suspected White was involved since the two had been seen together earlier. Several of them went to White's house that night to keep an eye on him until daylight. The search party remained at White's house until morning, when they began to search. The result in their finding the body on the edge of the hollow basin in the woods pasture, not far from the path leading in the direction of their homes. White was arrested and brought to trial, accused of murdering Daniel Hoppus. White's sister-in-law testified that upon returning home on the fatal day, he was very excited. He came home about 11 o'clock and said to her and his wife that Hoppus would not search any other house as long as he lived. The evidence was entirely circumstantial, as no one witnessed the murder. However, the jury found White guilty and sentenced him to be hanged on September the 20th. Since there was no positive evidence, efforts were made to have the sentence commuted by Governor Conrad Baker. The governor was out of state and ordered a postponement of the execution until November the 1st. Governor Baker came to Anderson and interviewed White in the Madison County Jail. After a thorough investigation, he chose not to commute the sentence. In 1867, the jail was a 2-story brick building on the northwest corner of Jackson and 9th Streets. And here I have a lithograph of Anderson in 1871. My arrow points to this building right here, which was the 2-story jailhouse. Today, that corner is occupied by T&J Tire Company. The night before his execution, members of the press visited White in his cell. They described him as stolid and uncommunicative and answered questions in monosyllables. The Reverend Father John B. Crawley, who tried earnestly to turn White's thoughts towards God, attended White. On the day of the execution, the crowd began to assemble from all directions in buggies, wagons, and ox carts. Young men arrived on horses with faces all aglow from the anticipation of the hanging. Around the public square in Anderson, there was much boasting among some of the 8,000 or 10,000 people assembled about the number of criminals they had seen hung. Interestingly, the city's population was only 1,300 when Anderson was incorporated 2 years earlier. So 8,000 or 10,000 people tell you a lot of them came from out of town to witness this. To witness a public hanging was a big deal. There was widespread interest in the crime and scene unfolding over the next few hours. That is the Madison County Courthouse at the time of this all took place. While White paced in his cell, the area outside took on a circus-like atmosphere. On one corner of the public square was a sideshow, the Wild Men of Afghanistan, where passers-by were enticed to enter and see the attraction. In the crowds were numerous young men selling what they claimed were pictures of White, and I have one. There he is. At noon, Milton White was escorted to the front gate of the jail yard. Around his neck was a rope that would send him to eternity. I need to just interject something here. The county jail in 1867 was a 2-story building. The first floor was administrative. The second floor had 2 cells. Think of what we're building out north of Anderson today and how many cells that is going to contain. The crowd was so large that guards with fixed bayonets were used to keep them back. With arms bound, the prisoner was then seated upon his coffin in the back of a wagon. Father Crawley was on one side of White, while Sheriff James H. Snell was on the other. Escorted by guards with bayonets, the procession proceeded from the jail north to what was then called Anderson Street. We know it as 8th Street now. And then they turned west. Many porches in front of the elegant homes on Anderson Street were full of people curiously watching the morbid sight. This house would have been present at that time. It's the only one on 8th Street today that's still standing that would have been present at the time of what I'm just now describing. White sat with his eyes closed, listening intently to Father Crowley. His conduct was sedate and dignified, putting to shame many of those in the procession that followed him to the fairgrounds in the area bounded today by 7th and 3rd Streets, Madison Avenue, and Hendrick Streets. The gallows had been erected in a thick forest of oak trees in the northeast corner of what is today the intersection of 7th Street and Madison Avenue. Today's area still exhibits many oak trees. No doubt some are witness trees to this event. The gallows were a plain platform with a railing, a trap in the center, and a crossbeam overhead. It was surrounded by a high wooden enclosure capable of holding 200 people. It required a ticket to be inside the closure. This is Madison Avenue. This is 7th Street. It would have been in this area, right in this area here, where the hanging took place. This is Hendrick Street, Madison Avenue, 7th Street. It would have been in this area right here. 10,000 people were crammed into the woods nearby, while an estimated 500 had climbed to the tops of the neighboring trees to view the proceedings. Sheriff Snell read the death warrant while White stood motionless, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. He then knelt with Father Crawley on the trap and repeated after him the Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria, the Apostles' Creed, and other church prayers. This is that area today. These trees undoubtedly would have been witness trees to what I'm describing. He did not confess the crime publicly. Instead, he claimed a respectable farmer of Madison County did it. He may have admitted to Father Crowley, but that will never be known. Final adjustments were then made to the rope. Sheriff Snell then placed a black cape over his head as White cast a last and lingering look upon the scene around him. The sheriff then took a sharp hatchet and severed the rope with one quick, nervous blow. There was a sickening thud as his 200-pound body, with the fall of 3 feet, shot through the trap, making the beam overhead quiver. His neck was broken by the fall, and not a single muscle moved after the body fell. After 27 minutes, the body was taken down, and doctors pronounced him dead. His body was placed in a coffin and buried in the potter's field of the newly opened St. Mary's Cemetery, south of town. I made a trip to the rectory of St. Mary's Church, where the records for this cemetery are kept, and determined from their records that this is that potter's field in the back of St. Mary's Cemetery. The first burials would have been around this tree, and then they would have come out like this. He was one of the very first burials. That cemetery had only been open 2 months when he was buried, so very, very good possibility he is in this area here. As if a reminder of the last public execution in Anderson was needed, the club with which Daniel Hoppus was killed was kept in the county clerk's office until the courthouse was destroyed by fire in December of 1880. Story number 7, the 3rd Madison County Fairgrounds, 1868. Several public-spirited citizens met in Anderson on May 16, 1868, and organized a joint stock fair association. It was known as the Madison County Joint Stock Agricultural Society. On May 31, 20 acres of land was acquired across Strawtown Road and slightly northwest of the old Anderson Fairgrounds of 1850-1855. The area I'm talking about in my arrow points to this. This is Madison Avenue. Of course, Madison Avenue stopped at the river. In order to cross the river at that time, you had to take the ford to go beyond. And this would be 8th Street. The area purchased was immediately north of present-day 8th Street, west of the railroad to the fairgrounds, Madison Avenue, and north to the vicinity of present-day 3rd Street. It will be recalled that in 1867, this was the site of the public hanging of Milton White. This is a Google Earth shot of that area today, and I've got it bounded. This is 8th Street, this is Madison Avenue, this is John Street, and this is 3rd Street. This was the site of our fairgrounds for years. The fair was held at this location in the fall of 1868. A sizable amount of money was spent to improve the facility. One of the first things done was to build a 7-foot plank fence surrounding the grounds, complete with gates and an entrance. There was an office and a dining hall as well. An amphitheater was erected for presentations, plus 3 halls were built for exhibitions. They were named Floral, Mechanical, and Art. One hall measured 20 by 80 feet, the other 20 by 30 feet. There were several cattle and horse stalls along with sheep and hog pens. 3 wells were sunk, walled, and furnished with pumps to provide the livestock with patrons drinking water. However, the main feature of the fairgrounds was a 1/2 mile circuit track that ran parallel to the Fairgrounds Road, or Madison Avenue. It was situated roughly between what is today 7th Street and near 3rd Street. Madison Avenue and Hendrick Street would have been the track. That track was utilized to exhibit horses in harness and under saddle. Again, I outline it for you here: 3rd Street, Madison Avenue, Hendrick Street, and 7th Street. This would have been that 1/2 mile track. Trotters, pacers, and runners were trendy and drew large crowds. Thursday was always considered the best day because thousands attended the fair to see and enjoy the horse racing. Stones encircled the track to keep the horse and rider within the track boundaries. No fences, just stones. One stone has survived. There it is. Now, the person that lives in that house doesn't know that. I pulled up one day in the car. I knew of that stone. I pulled up one day in the car to take this picture. The lady came out and she sat down in that chair, arms folded, and just stared at me the whole time. I quickly took my picture, and from the look on her face, I thought, I'm not even going to explain what I'm doing. I'll just leave. The grounds became famous throughout Indiana for their beauty, being situated among numerous large oak trees and the accommodations provided for exhibitors and the public. Over the next 19 years, attendance was strong. It was reported that on the third day of 1873 fair, more than one-third of the entire population of Madison County was present on the grounds. Well, I was curious. The county's population in 1873 was approximately 24,000, meaning 8,000 were in attendance on September 4th, 1873, if the claim is correct. From 1887 to 1890, interest in the fair began to fall off. The decrease in attendance caused the society to become involved in debt. In addition, Anderson had grown beyond the limits of the grounds in every direction. The city desired to open streets through the property and open it to development. The society's stockholders decided it would be in the association's interest to dispose of the grounds and settle its affairs. The decision came after the 1890 fair. That winter, the Indiana legislature passed an enabling act authorizing the society to sell and convey all corporate property, distribute the proceeds, and cease to exist. The fairgrounds were divided into lots and dealt with the act's passage. Today, the area that was the fairgrounds is heavily populated with homes. In other words, the ground was much more valuable to be developed than it was as a fairgrounds. And the city was growing. This was the beginning of the gas boom, and we were exploding in population. Number 8 on our story today, number 8 story is Riley Place, 1887 to 1879. James Whitcomb Riley's employer, Mr. Ethel, owned a boarding house on the southwest corner of 8th and Morton Streets. Riley roomed there from 1877 to 1879 while employed by the Anderson Democrat, the local newspaper. Today that corner is called Riley Place. If you've been by it, you might have noticed above this, that was at one time the Gwynn Canada drugstore, but that Riley Place is named for that because of the presence of the boarding house that was once there that James Whitcomb Riley lived in. On the door, beside the door, is a plaque. And there it is, and I won't bother to read it. It's basically telling you what I just have told you. Supposedly, Riley began to dabble in the writing of poetry while living there. Not wanting anyone to know, he sent his writings to a newspaper in Kokomo and signed his work anonymous. The poetry was favorably received, so much so that the public demanded the author's name. Eventually that was revealed, and the rest is history. The Hoosier poet, James Whitcomb Riley. Story number 9, the gas boom era, 1887 to 1902. On March 31, 1887, natural gas was discovered in Anderson. The first gas well was sunk in what was, you may remember, the supermarket Evie's on Meridian Street. Well, in their parking lot was the location of the well. This historical marker was put up years ago to denote that. The discovery transformed a small town into an industrial and transportation center overnight. Gas and related industries brought many wealthy and enterprising business people to town, many making their homes on the fashionable 8th Street residential district. Numerous homes were built in the last decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century, when Anderson was known as the Queen City of the gas belt, and the population was steadily growing. Historic West 8th Street, historical marker telling that. And now for some old pictures of some of those homes that were along 8th Street and where I've been able to identify the owner of that home. Some of those homes are no longer there. Others have been remodeled. Joseph Fiedling. Daniel Mustard's home. Thomas W. Wright's home. You may recognize that as the old Roselle Funeral Home. The A. Morgenroth, Judge H.C. Ryan, George W. Hadley, J. E. Van Deventer, S. J. Mack, George S. Parker, and Harder Home. Most of the district's development took place during the gas boom. The district represented an essential time in Anderson's history and housed many notable citizens who gained prominence. Most of these residents remain today as reminders of a prosperous time in Anderson and offer the potential for preserving this segment of the past. In addition to the many fine homes constructed on 8th Street, 2 other construction projects took place that directly resulted from the population growth. Anderson City Hall took up residence along with the No. 1 fire station in a brand new building opened in 1890 and located on the southwest corner of Central Avenue and 8th Street. That was the No. 1 fire station here below. City Hall occupied this portion of the building above. And on the southwest corner of Madison Avenue and 8th Street, Columbia Elementary School opened in 1893. How many of you went to Columbia? I did. Fond memories of Columbia. The last story today is about the home hospital, 1920 to 1925. The home hospital was founded by Ernest Pierce, who came to Anderson in 1920. Pierce was a native of Cornwall, England, and a mining engineer by profession who, in the mines of northwest Canada, had done much first aid work among stricken miners. He selected a building that suited the modest needs of his first adventure in the hospital field, and it became successful under his administration. The opening of the home hospital in Anderson was the outgrowth of a movement for founding a Protestant hospital in a city that provide citizens with an alternative to St. John's Hospital, a Catholic hospital. Home Hospital opened in 1920 at 325 to 333 West 8th Street. The hospital operated for 5 years, closing in 1925. The building then became the Mashallah Apartments, Mashallah being a word of Turkish origin, meaning God be with you. On Saturday morning, February 22nd, 1936, the former hospital was destroyed by fire, and I have a picture of that. You see the Anderson Fire Department. It's February morning, snow on the ground, and this is that home hospital. It was so utterly destroyed by the fire that morning that it had to be torn down. Today's site is the Elmo Funk Memorial Park at 329 West 8th Street. That is on the site of the hospital. And we have concluded today's presentation.